really Lincoln was doomed from all sides, and he could not. None of them saw him as a centrist that was trying to keep everyone together. They just saw him on the other side.
Right. I think that's true. And I think we and Bill's book, I think, does this so well, is that the 19th century is not our century, and it's very easy to impose our standards on that century. It was a highly partisan culture, and in fact, if I'm not mistaken, someone like Lincoln himself was a partisan figure, and would have scorned someone that was an independent, really. So yeah, he wasn't seen as a kind of a centrist figure at all. He did get it from all sides.
Yeah, and he just could not win, I think. You write that most of the loathers have their own, changes with time a bit. The issues are the same, but the agendas of who's loathing changes as decades go on, and it's really to advance their own. And agendas, which you say are usually illiberal as well, wanting to scale back whatever social liberties that have come to people. So just to kind of explain that, the illiberal aspect to this.
Well, you mean over time, or do you mean in the 1860s?
Start with the 1860s.
Well, I think in the 1860s, and is that if you, what the Republican Party is really trying to do is, it seems to me, and I agree with Jim Oakes's point of view on this, they really are trying to kill slavery. Now, they may be wanting to do it peacefully, by hemming it in and by not enforcing the fugitive slave law and things of that nature, but they do want to see it peacefully die. And when you have this, when slavery is going to die, then if, assuming that's going to occur, and I think that the Republicans thought that was going to occur, whether it was going to be in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, they thought that, it's almost inescapable that you're going to have these issues of, well, if the slaves are freed, then you have the issues of racial equality. It's not, and I do think, as Eric Foner has said, that race it's more our obsession than it was the 19th century, but
race versus slavery.
Versus slavery, right? Because you can't do anything about equality until you kill slavery first. I think might be one way to look at it. But at any rate, you do have this idea that the country, and I think the critics of Lincoln saw this, that the country would be more inclusive, and would be, and rights might expand. That might be the implications of if Republicans can win elections, and so there is this hostility to that, and I would call that illiberal.
Bill, you state in here, it's a fascinating story. You mentioned it already, how it came almost from the bottom up. It was the civilians who defined what a traitor was, how they got punished. They were ahead of the military and the governments, but what impact did they have on the military government and the judiciary, for that matter, if it was coming from the bottom up?
Actually, the judiciary, the only place that they really got involved was in maritime cases. That was where they made their major impact. And it was a major impact, actually, which may sound kind of strange, because that seems like it's ancillary to the war. But the Supreme Court made several important rulings during the war that were called the prize cases, and actually there were 4 cases involved. But they showed that the Supreme Court and the judiciary were going to be behind the administration's determination of what was a traitor. And they helped define the war for the Union. And they also, it was a nice loophole, they used international law so that they could consider the Confederates as actually warring nation without conveying to them the title of a nation, so that they could still try them as traitors afterwards. So it was a wonderful way of having their cake and eating it too. So that's what the judiciary did. But what the public did was far more important, I think, in the terms of it was really setting the parameters of freedom at the ground level. And the military was helping them, especially through provost marshals and other military officers who were in communities at that time. And many of these cases would flare up, just as they did in Missouri. I have a case in Missouri that occurred where you could see that the officer in charge, a lieutenant, is just getting vexed by what women are doing on the home front, suspecting that they might be helping guerrilla networks in this particular case. But yet you could see this is just petty characters going at each other and bringing down the full-fledged might of the Union military on these women, accusing them of being traitors, forcing them to report every Friday to the military officer in that community, which is, by the way, this is a loyal community. Missouri is still part of the Union then. None of this is going up to Washington. None of this is actually superseding that particular level. So what you see is a reconciliation between what Mark Neely, my colleague, has argued that Lincoln's political arrests were limited and targeted. And that's true. But when you go down to the grassroots level and you start to see what was going on there, you understand that it's much more messy, it's much more egregious, much more characters are getting involved in this. And what's happening is that Washington is actually serving as almost a brake on this kind of activity as it filters up, as it did in the case of specifically religious persecution from a case in St. Louis. And then later, the War Department actually tried to condone and allow the replacement of any minister in the Confederacy that the Union Army went to, in which they determined to be disloyal. They were allowed to just yank that minister, replace him, and not have the congregation have any say in it. Lincoln pulled the plug on that.
I had a letter once from Harry Truman giving advice to someone who was getting into politics and saying that, remember that everything is local.
Yeah.
And when it gets local, it gets to be human nature too.
Yeah.
And here we have humans doing this in a time of huge stress,
Mm-hmm.
the Civil War, more than anyone has ever seen before in this country. So, even though you state in the book that many tried to do the right thing, but many others didn't. They just, their emotions, their preconceptions, whatever it was, their human nature, came to the fore instead.
And then what it also taught me was that there's a whole strand in the literature today that argues about how the Civil War was such a centralizing force, especially for government. But what you see when you analyze it from the standpoint of policing disloyalty and treason is how weak that apparatus was, that it had so many problems, and that even when you place a central hand in a community, like a provost marshal, that provost marshal, in order to get his job done and find deserters and ferret out treason, has to hire local people. And those local people, if they're in a democratic community, are not going to help him all that much. And there's a lot of vexation in just trying to actually put that federal apparatus into communities. And that was one of the pure joys that I found, actually, was just seeing how the story of centralized government was still ill-formed at that moment.
Yeah. But that's what many of the loathers thought. It's not. It's the government, and the buck stops right up there. And they felt from the beginning that this black Republican was in there to change everything, and it didn't matter, no? So the executive power that they saw, and of course executive power did increase during that time, for good or ill, but that's what they loathed.
Oh, absolutely. And I was reading Bill's book on the plane up here, and I thought that was an interesting point that you made, that this idea of this centralization is just not true, and it wasn't true after the war either. I mean, only in some very limited senses. And certainly, and as I make this point later in the book, is that that really, if the South seceded in 1860 and 61, but it really kind of had a virtual secession once troops were pulled out of the South in the 1870s, and they got to run their own affairs, much to the detriment of a good number of Americans.
Flashing forward to our time, you spoke about Lerone Bennett, forced into glory, and First of all, what sort of an impact did that book have on the African American community, especially, and how did it fare over a little bit of time? It was certainly, he was accusing Lincoln of being a racist. He never wanted to free the slaves. He was forced into that glory, and emancipation didn't do anything. All that. Actually, I was there with you at that. And I also
Right.
heard that. And he got a very respectful hearing.
Right.
It's hard to come against someone who all of a sudden in the middle of their talk leaves his feet in passion. He did. He got off the floor about that high in passion and vehemence. And I thought the best rejoinder, at least succinct, was Gabor Borat. And Gabor said that, the Declaration of Independence didn't free anybody. We had to fight for it. And the Emancipation Proclamation, same thing. It had to be fought for, but it started on the road that was not going to veer away. Bennett called us a Lincoln cult, and Spielberg, though I think had a better term, he called us Lincoln obsessives.
Okay.
Probably a little
That's
bit
more
better,
kind, huh?
Yeah.
But how has it fared in not only African Americans, but especially there and outside of it?
Well, I think that I'm not an expert in African American history, but I think I do want to say that. But what I would say is that I think that when Lerone Bennett first wrote about Lincoln as a racist, that was in 1968. Well, what's going on in America in 1968? We have the Vietnam War, and this is a war in which the poor and minorities are disproportionately being drafted and killed in Vietnam. We have the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. The country, Robert F. Kennedy, the country does appear to be unraveling, and I think there is a sense, well, what would previous leaders have done? And Bennett's answer was, I think, that Lincoln is no solution to any of our problems. He is the problem. And it had great resonance, I think, at that time. And then when you add in, think about what happened after 1968 in this country, and you have, the Watergate scandals, the revelations of the Church Committee in the 70s about CIA assassination activities overseas. There's a deep, deep cynicism about American government and politicians, and it has not gone away. And so some of the, and I think others, Barry Schwartz most specifically has written about this, some of the decline in Lincoln's reputation was probably inevitable. And then also in the 1970s, you had the revelations over the Tuskegee syphilis experiments in Alabama, and that had a deep influence over the black community. So I think that some of that, would have happened if Lerone Bennett had never written that essay in the 1960s. And then, of course, he followed this book up in the 1990s, Forced into Glory, or 2000. But I make the point in the book that I'm not really sure how influential that is. I do think it retains some influence. I've had African American students. I was a public school teacher for nearly 20 years, over 20 years, and I have had African American parents that have, recommended the book to me. I did a radio show the other day in Houston, an African American host, and he has Lerone Bennett's book posted on his Facebook page. So it does have some influence, but then the most powerful African American politician in the history of the United States, if not the entire world, is Barack Obama, and he's a Lincoln admirer. And you have.
Of course, he's not an American, so.
Well. So, and then you have Thomas Sowell, a conservative or libertarian economist, depending upon how you characterize him. He has written some wonderful defenses of Lincoln. He works at the Hoover Institution. So I just don't know how influential it is. I don't think it retains the political influence that it once maybe had.
So the influence of Lincoln haters has had effects here and there, but doesn't seem to have been lasting as far as getting deep into the American psyche. And we're still alive here, for heaven's sakes. So,
yeah. Well, I think maybe not directly, but I think you can have indirect influence.
Has it had more influence in certain eras than others?
in certain areas or certain
Eras.
eras. I think that this is an era when it does have some influence. I think that's true. And certainly, in for example, from the 1890s to the 1950s in the South, the United Daughters of the Confederacy and others, they had great influence within that region over, what was taught in their schools about Lincoln, or whether he was even mentioned at all.
Sure.
I think
That's
it
what
also
explains
has helped open up the dialogue about Lincoln in ways that we may not have done. In other words, we're going to ask questions about Lincoln that we might not have asked, even if we're not approaching it as a Lincoln loather,
Right.
which is exactly what happened even with my book.